Rome wasn't built in a day, but if you wanted to see justice done in the age when Rome ruled the Mediterranean, you didn't have to wait too long for your sentence. In this episode, we bring you a judgment from history's fastest track court. The Roman Empire was an early modern state in comparison to the ancient Greeks, whose ideal court proceedings were documented by Aristotle in his book on rhetoric. But while Greek courts aspired to be temples of justice, Romans knew that law and order depended on keeping people in line. And so, in the frenetic heart of the city, beneath marble forums and soaring temples, magistrates dispensed justice at a dizzying pace. Under the Republic, Rome had inherited and adapted the 12 Tables, one of the earliest written law codes in the Western world dating back to around 450 BCE. The tables set out severe penalties for a range of offenses, including fines and, for the most serious crimes, exile or the death penalty. But the Romans weren't big on due process. As the Republic gave way to the empire, provincial governors and magistrates could use the law to crush their enemies or anyone who stood in their way. Under Augustus, the first emperor, trials became a tool for political control. By the mid-1st century CE, according to the historian Tacitus, it was possible to be prosecuted for anything anywhere in the empire. A convenient way of silencing critics and rounding up potential rivals. Defendants could be paraded through the streets in shackles, their accusers egging on the crowd. In the heat of the moment, a senator might demand punishment, torture, to extract a confession. The lowest social class in Roman society received the worst punishments, often beaten with rods or flogged with leather straps. They might be thrown into dark, dank dungeons, left to die of cold and hunger. If they survived, they would likely die on the execution block. But torture was not unheard of for free men either. Under Nero, the rich and influential were put on trial and executed, including the emperor's own mother, Agrippina the Younger, and his wife, Poppaea. Once found guilty, the condemned were escorted through the Forum, the center of Roman public life, towards the place of their punishment. This was a kind of victory march for the accusers, and a humiliating experience for the condemned. Men, women, and children crowded the streets to get a good look at the shameful spectacle. But let's say you were innocent. Well, your fate wasn't much better, because the whole purpose of these displays was deterrence. Even if you were free, the odds were stacked against you. Juries were easily swayed by an impassioned prosecutor or the prestige of a powerful accuser. Advocates, like Roman senators, were generally higher on the societal rungs than their clients, many of whom were slaves. A skilled advocate could make a compelling case, but ultimately, the outcome of a trial depended on who you knew, not what you knew. According to Roman legal scholars, it was possible to rig a jury beforehand or bribe the magistrate to find a defendant guilty. In practice, then, the courts were little more than a rubber stamp on the decisions of more powerful men. If you managed to drag yourself to the courthouse steps without being arrested, you still had to contend with the bar of public opinion. Roman legal proceedings were notorious for their theatricality. Juries expected flowery speeches and dramatic gestures, and a shrewd lawyer knew how to play to his audience. Suppose you were representing a slave accused of stealing from his master. You might accuse the master of deliberately setting his servant up to take the fall for his own embezzlement. Or you could argue that the prosecution had concocted the whole affair to cover up a series of extra-legal activities. Such tactics, known as subterfuges, could sometimes delay a case for years, and in the meantime, a defendant might languish in prison without ever having been tried. So after all that waiting, what kind of sentence could you expect? The options were limited. Magistrates usually handed down punishments intended to deter future crimes, which meant that the sentence fit the supposed crime. For slaves convicted of theft, for example, punishment might include banishment from the city or execution. Free men convicted of financial crimes might be sentenced to pay heavy fines or spend time in jail. But even the most heinous crimes, such as murder, rarely carried the death penalty. Instead, the guilty party might be exiled or forbidden from leaving the city. As the Roman Empire expanded, provinces across its vast dominion took on local characteristics. Likewise, criminal trials varied from place to place. In Alexandria, for instance, Jews and Christians were prosecuted for not worshiping the emperor as a god. While the penalty for murder in Rome was normally exile, provincial courts sometimes imposed the death penalty. That said, in places like Greece and Asia Minor, judges occasionally displayed leniency towards criminals, granting them conditional release or reducing their sentences. But whether the guilty were banished, beheaded, or merely fined, their punishment was always public, designed to remind other Romans that crime did not pay and the emperor's power knew no bounds. Thank you for watching this episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and stay tuned for more historical tales. Rome was a city obsessed with honor and order, a place where public executions were as common as traffic and as entertaining as football matches today. Spectators would flock to the Colosseum to watch men fight to the death, not because they were particularly bloody, but because it was considered a respectable and even educational pastime. In fact, one Roman senator said that going to watch a good fight was just as important as going to a good party. But all that bloodshed had a purpose. to remind Romans that in their great city, mercy was a luxury the powerful could afford, but everyone else had to earn. It was an intoxicating, heady mix of violence and spectacle that set Rome apart from other cities in the ancient world. In this chapter, we will look at one of the most infamous spectacles of all, the condemned to the beasts. As spectators crowded into the Colosseum to watch men and animals kill each other, they were about to see death from up close and personal, and there was no escape. By the time the Roman Empire was in its glory, the condemnation to beasts, or damnatio ad bestias, had become one of the most feared and anticipated punishments in the empire. It didn't matter whether you were a Christian, a foreign captive, or a slave. If the emperor or the ruling class wanted you dead, you would be thrown to the lions, so to speak. In the days leading up to the event, the condemned would be paraded through the streets, naked and covered in oil, or honey. This was done to humiliate them and to make sure that everyone knew what was going to happen to them. The crowds would often throw fruit and other objects at the condemned, and sometimes they would even be forced to fight in mock battles with wooden weapons. At dawn, the condemned would be taken to the arena. There they would be given a wooden staff or a rusted glaive, and then they would be herded into the center of the arena, with the cages of lions, bears, leopards, or even elephants. The gates of the arena would then burst open, and the crowd would roar as the lions lunged for their prey. The whole event was designed to be as terrifying as possible, for both the condemned and the spectators. The lions were often starved for days before the event, so that they would be as hungry and vicious as possible. The crowds would cheer as the lions tore their prey to pieces, and the condemned were given no chance of survival. Some condemned managed to stumble across the sand for a few seconds or minutes, raising their arms in a futile defense as the crowd watched intently, enjoying the hunt. These shows were not only a form of entertainment, but also a way of showing the power of Rome. The condemned were often made to fight more than one animal, and sometimes they were even pitted against each other. However, on rare occasions, the condemned were given a second chance. If they managed to survive the initial attack of the beasts, the crowd might spare them. In some cases, pardoned gladiators would also duel beasts to cement their heroism in the eyes of the crowd. For the common criminal, however, the arena was a kind of graveyard in miniature, a blood-soaked theater where human screams mingled with animal roars and the audience applauded the show of force and power. The scenes of carnage in the Roman arenas were not merely spectacles of bloodlust, but carefully crafted displays of imperial might. By showcasing the power of Rome over both man and beast, the emperors affirmed their own dominance. The condemned were used as pawns in this game of life and death, their fates hanging in the balance, as the crowds reveled in the thrill of the hunt. So next time you find yourself glued to a thrilling game of cat and mouse on your screen, take a moment to think about the echoes of the past. Remember the condemned who fought for their lives in the shadow of the Colosseum. Their stories may be long gone, but their bravery and resilience live on in our shared love for a good story. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Please don't forget to share and like. Until next time, from the darkest pits of human history comes a chilling spectacle, a punishment so gruesome it makes the blood freeze in your veins. Today, we delve into the horrifying tales of two such punishments from ancient Rome, each more terrifying than the last. Our first horror story takes us to the heart of ancient Rome, where justice was served with a side of barbarity. Picture this ponacule, otherwise known as the sack of the parricide. In the annals of bizarre Roman punishments, this one takes the crown. But hold on tight, because what follows will leave you speechless. You see, back in those ancient times, killing one's father, mother, or close relative was considered the ultimate sin. It was a cosmic violation of the sacred bond of family, and the Romans took this sacrilege to an unimaginable extreme. Those found guilty of this heinous crime were sewn up in a leather sack, along with a menagerie of live animals. Typically, a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. Talk about a wild ride into hell. This concoction was then tossed into a nearby river, leaving the condemned to a fate worse than death. The ritual was as terrifying as it was excruciating. At the crack of dawn, the person was stripped naked, beaten with rods until their flesh was a mosaic of pain and humiliation. They were then laid flat in the sack, still alive, and the animals were let in, unleashing a frenzy of bites, scratches, and chaos. The rooster flapped its wings, the dog bit, the viper struck, and the monkey screeched. Meanwhile, the condemned was left to suffocate in the darkness, the cacophony of screams and panic echoing their own terror. Romans gathered along the riverbank, spectators to this macabre show, as boats carrying the sack were cast into the Tiber River. Amidst the morning mist, the sack bobbed, a grim silhouette against the murky water. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as it disappeared into the depths. Only the gurgling of water breaking the surface served as a grim reminder of the fate that befell the parricide. It was a punishment that not only took their life, but also their dignity, their very essence, leaving nothing but a stain on the water and the memory of their crime. But our journey through Roman horrors doesn't end there. We now turn to the chilling tale of Decimatio, a punishment so brutal it shook the very foundations of military discipline. In the vast military machinery of Rome, discipline wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced with an iron fist. When entire legions faltered, when the very core of the military unit wavered, commanders resorted to the ultimate form of chastisement, meaning cutting down by tens. This punishment derived its name and its horror from the Latin word decim, meaning 10. There was no trial, no appeal, just blind obedience and brutal efficiency. Soldiers were grouped into tens, and a lot was drawn, determining their fate. The unlucky ones became the lot, retreating man, while the rest were bound. The chosen soldier, the lot, was then killed by his 9 mates, armed with nothing more than wooden clubs. The horror of decimation lay not just in the taking of life, but in the cold, calculated manner in which it was carried out. Each soldier taken was a brother in arms, a comrade in the face of danger. But when discipline faltered, camaraderie was cast aside and replaced by a chilling duty to punish. This macabre lottery ensured that every soldier faced the possibility of death, fostering an atmosphere of perpetual fear and unquestioning obedience. For the condemned, there was no glory in death, only a brutal end at the hands of those they had fought alongside. And so we come to the end of this harrowing journey through the darkest depths of ancient Roman punishments. If you found this video intriguing and informative, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more. Also, be sure to share this spine-chilling tale with your friends and family. Until next time, stay safe and keep an eye out for those pesky monkeys with a taste for human sacrifice. You see, the condemned man kneeling before you is not Jesus Christ, but rather a nameless soldier. And the one about to nail him to the cross is not Pontius Pilate, but a random centurion. Oh, and that guy just nailed someone else to the cross, and this guy has been dead for some time now. So what's going on here? Easy. This is a scene from your standard Roman crucifixion, except we've swapped out the victim for someone else. Say, an unarmed Jewish rebel, a captured Gaul, anyone who might end up getting nailed to a cross anyway. In fact, let us just make this guy a Jew, because the Romans crucified lots of Jews, and it rhymes with But the important thing is that this guy is about to die whether he's Jewish or not. And since this story is basically over, let's speed it up a little bit. There we go. That wasn't so hard, was it? And there you have it. An account of the crucifixion of a nameless person in the province of Judea. In all likelihood, our victim didn't get a fair trial, and his execution probably wasn't even legal. But don't worry too much about that. In the world of the Roman Empire, trials and laws were only really necessary to maintain the illusion of justice. And if you think about it, we're all really just expendable pawns in the game of power. Alright, moving on. Now, it may seem odd to us today, but for many Romans, watching people get tortured and murdered was a perfectly normal way to spend a day off. And it wasn't just passive entertainment either. Romans actively participated in the spectacles of blood by placing bets on which victims would last the longest, or cheering and jeering as they watched prisoners get torn apart by wild animals. But there were also more intimate ways to enjoy the fruits of Roman power. Take, for instance, the example of that old chestnut, decimation, the classic Roman punishment for cowardice and mutiny. The scene was grim. On a dusty plain, the condemned soldier kneeled, blindfolded, begging for mercy as his comrades raised one strike to the head, another to the back, and the survivor collapsed in agony. The 9 who wielded the clubs were then dispersed, each dismissed from the legion and marked for dishonor. Decimation served 2 purposes. It instilled terror in the troops. One coward could cost 9 lives, and it enforced collective responsibility. Subsequent units witnessed the ritual with horror. Even seasoned veterans trembled at the prospect. Roman historians record that legions demoralized by heavy losses and would sometimes solve their woes via this savage lottery of death. Oh, and by the way, if you want to know more about the Roman army, check out the series in the description. Back to the show. While decimation was reserved for the most extreme cases of disobedience, other, lesser crimes could be dealt with more swiftly and more pleasantly. If a soldier deserted his post, refused to obey an order, struck a superior officer, or otherwise committed an offense against the state, he might be subjected to fusuarium, a public flogging with clubs or rods. The punishment was administered by the centurion, and the full troop was generally present to witness it. Troops formed a circle, stripped to the waist or loincloths, as the offender knelt on a shield. The centurion delivered blows with a cudgel, and fellow soldiers took turns until the victim expired. Sometimes the punishment was carried out with leather straps and embedded with shards of metal. Scorpions. The scorpions tore flesh as they landed. The goal was not necessarily to kill, but to maim, to leave visible scars that branded the criminal long after the agony had ended. Women and children could be present at such executions, which took place in the forum or at market crossroads. Civilians, too, were not exempt. A prostitute could be whipped for solicitation, a debtor for failure to pay. Even at night, a lantern-lit flogging session could draw curious onlookers, drawn by the macabre intersection of justice and bloodsport. So if you ever find yourself in ancient Rome, don't do anything. You don't want to end up crucified. A. Watching, waiting, or worse, participating in. When you think of the most horrifying ways to die, what comes to mind? Maybe being eaten alive by wild animals? Perhaps, well, that's one possibility under the sentence of the beasts. As in, to be sent to the beasts. But another option is far more terrifying, and it's about to get a whole lot worse. Stay tuned until the end of this episode to find out what it means to be burned by night. Burning by day was bad enough. A Roman sentenced to death by fire could be locked up in a tower or have their house set ablaze. But these punishments were relatively quick and merciful compared to another form of capital punishment. Crematio, per noctem or burning by night, was reserved for the worst criminals. Those who committed what we today might call white-collar crimes. Let's imagine a Roman senator found guilty of bribery or extortion. His career is over. His property is confiscated. He's been stripped of his rank and power. Now he's a nobody, and the punishment is brutal, designed not only to kill him, but also to prevent his body from receiving any kind of burial, a fate worse than death. The condemned would be tied up and left to die slowly and painfully outside a town. Sometimes they were thrown into a pre-dug ditch. Other times, they had to sit on a stone or wooden platform. But either way, they were always in plain sight, a warning to anyone who walked by of what happens to those who break the law. And the punishment wasn't just reserved for men. Women could be burned by night as well as anyone who committed a crime against the state, such as plotting to overthrow the emperor. Even relatives would uncome to save the condemned person, because they didn't want to be tainted by association. A common sight in Rome was for victims to be chained up outside the gate of the city, forced to watch the sun go down over the horizon, while knowing that when darkness fell, their fate would become even worse. They would be given wine to dull their senses and offered a last chance to recant. But if the condemned refused to cooperate, that meant the show could begin. Fire was an important part of Roman religious life. It was used in rituals to purify objects and people, and it was commonly believed that fire could destroy evil as well. Because of this, the fire used in crematio per noctem was no ordinary blaze. Two kinds of flames were thought to exist, one that could harm people and one that couldn't. The latter was called mundus sindolo, or unharmed by the world. To create this kind of fire, Romans would burn certain woods like cedar, juniper, and laurel. These flames could touch a person without causing physical harm, but they could still cause a great deal of psychological trauma. If the condemned person was especially hated, spectators would be allowed to take part by hurling insults and even objects at the victim. But when night truly fell, the mood would become darker and more sinister. The fire was set, but rather than going out to watch it, Romans believed it was bad luck to look directly at the burning pyre. So instead, people would gather around nearby, casting long, dancing shadows on the surrounding trees and buildings. They might have cheered, laughed, or jeered as they watched the condemned writhe in pain. Some might have even gambled on how long the victim would live. As the fire raged, the victim's body would become covered in blisters, and their flesh would eventually start to char. This is where the spectacle became even more gruesome. People would hurl objects into the fire, creating showers of sparks that flew into the crowd. And if you got too close to the fire, you might have gotten singed or even burned to death. But this danger was outweighed by the morbid fascination Romans had for watching someone die. Slowly, the heat from the fire would drive onlookers to a feverish pit. If they were lucky, the victim would pass out before long and avoid feeling the full force of the flames. Otherwise, they would scream and thrash about until their cries became hoarse and their movements slowed. Eventually, though, the flames would claim them, and their screams would turn into gurgling breaths. And as their bodies burned away, some parts of their bodies would be tossed into the air and sail through the night sky before hitting the ground and sending up sparks. When only charred bones remained, the fire had done its work, purifying both the victim and the onlookers. At least that's what Romans believed. In reality, there was nothing purifying about what happened next. Bones were gathered up and mixed with vinegar, which was then sprinkled on the crowd. The idea was that this would ward off any lingering evil spirits and prevent them from haunting the living. Then the ash was dispatched to distant parts of the empire, usually by ship, to ensure that none of the criminals' remains ended up back in Rome. For the record, to be burned by night was the ultimate disgrace. There was no funeral, no tomb, not even a gravestone. It was as if the person had never existed. Now check out Hadada, Sent to the Lions, or click this other video instead. Rome was not built in a day, but if you want to see its construction, you need only visit the Colosseum. It is an iconic amphitheater that opened 2,000 years ago and hosted the bloodiest spectacles of the Roman Empire. But I don't care about the Colosseum. I'm here to talk about something much more interesting. What happens when the mighty Roman Empire gets a taste of its own medicine? As centuries passed, these punishments faded away or were repurposed under Christian emperors, yet their imprint on Rome's legacy endures. Inscriptions, satirical poems, and the very stones of the Colosseum whisper of human cruelty, cloaked in civic ritual. It reminds us that in Rome, Justice and spectacle were inseparable. A lesson in power, morality, and the lengths to which a civilization will go to assert its dominance. In our modern age, we look back in horror and fascination. The streets of ancient Rome no longer run with blood, yet the stories remain, vivid as the torch-lit executions of the past. And perhaps in recalling these brutal ceremonies, we understand anew the value of mercy, the fragility of human rights, and the heavy price of order, enforced by fear. But let's be honest, it's not all that interesting. I mean, have you ever been to Rome? It's crowded, noisy, hot, and the food is terrible. Not much has changed, actually, except now there are more tourists. Just imagine what it must have been like to live there during the reign of Nero. The year is 64 AD. You are Gaius a Roman senator, and you've just returned from a long trip. Your villa has been occupied, so you decide to take a stroll through the city before checking into your usual hotel. It's hot, the wine is bad, and you're about to step into a nightmare. A fire has broken out and is spreading quickly through the narrow streets. Panicked citizens are running for the hills, abandoning their homes and possessions. You make your way to the center of the city, and the closer you get to the fire, the more obvious it becomes that this is no accident. Entire buildings are leveled, leaving you with the impression that some divine power is testing the strength of your city. You've heard rumors that the emperor's wife has been involved in setting fires in the past. But surely this is just a horrible coincidence, right? Wrong. This is the infamous Great Fire of Rome, which would burn for 6 days and ravage 10% of the city. When it's finally extinguished, you find that your neighborhood is completely destroyed, and you're not alone. Some 80,000 citizens are now homeless, and the entire face of the city has been altered forever. You might think that such a catastrophe would be the end of Nero's troubles, but you're wrong again. In fact, he would go on to rule for another 3 years, setting the standard for future emperors who want to stay in power. And that's 1 minute. See you tomorrow.